starting around the 13th century. One was the rise of the so-called mendicant orders, particularly the Dominicans. Mendicant were beggars. The Dominicans were created as their initial objective was to get rid of heresy. Santo Domingo, in his travels, learned of what's called the Albigensian heresy, or the Cathars, and he decided to form an order to combat that. And his idea was to emulate the Cathars. The Cathars were ruled by a sect of what were called the good men, who were ascetic sect, who led by example through their good works, and he had an idea to emulate that through his order to create an ascetic sect who, through good works and sermonizing, would lead the Cathars back into Christianity. But that soon proved too slow for the rulers of France at the time. They imposed an inquisition, the first inquisition, first modern inquisition, and the Dominicans, after the death of Santo Domingo, took charge of that, and that became their much more militaristic mission to eradicate heresy by any means. And many of these means were violent. This is the first institution of burning at the stake of heretics. The first time it was done in Europe. Eventually the Franciscans, who, as you all know, had also a very peaceful beginning, began to join the Dominicans in some of these anti-Jewish efforts. Another factor was the discovery of the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is the Jewish works that came out after the destruction of the temple, that were believed to represent the oral law that was passed down by the priest of the temple and originally derived from God. But what the Talmud meant for the Christians was that because the Talmud came after Christ, it didn't merit any of the kind of respect that had to be given the Old Testament. And an apostate named Nicholas Donin in 1230 began to claim that much of the Talmud, or parts of the Talmud, were anti-Christian or heretical and anti-Christ. And so it began to be publicly condemned. It was burned in Paris. And in 1263, there was an important disputation held in Barcelona under the directorate of the Dominicans. And the great Jewish philosopher Nachmanides personally defended the Talmud successfully, but in the end, because the account that he left, which did contain some passages critical of Christianity, he eventually had to go in self-exile in Israel, where he died. But I think one of the leading occasions that led to some of the tensions and the downfall of the Jews through the mass conversion came out in the reign of the man known as Pedro the Cruel of Castile, 1425 to 1454. What happened then was Pedro ended up fighting a civil war between his bastard half-brother Enrique Trastamara, and Enrique cynically began to latch on to the idea that he could exploit anti-Jewish settlements as a way to gain power. He did this two ways. First, he held Jewish communities, he extorted Jewish communities, he held them hostage, and he used them to help finance his campaigns through extortion. And secondly, he began to spread rumors that both Pedro the Cruel was favorable to the Jews. He called him King of the Jews, and even rumors that Pedro the Cruel himself was part Jewish. Now, Pedro the Cruel did have a Jewish treasurer known as Samuel Halavi, but his policies weren't any more favorable to the Jews than was traditional among the Spanish leaders at the time. This is the famous Synagoga del Tránsito in Toledo, and it was built as a personal chapel of Samuel Halavi, who, as I said, was a treasurer to Pedro the Cruel. You'll see in my book, this is also an inset from the same temple. It's a coat of arms of Samuel Halavi, and it has both a traditional Castilian coat of arms on the top, but Hebrew lettering on the bottom. But Halavi eventually was accused of embezzlement by Pedro, and condemned to death at a time when Pedro was beginning to feel paranoid because of the opposition led against him and beginning to execute some of his closest advisors. This didn't lead to general anti-Jewish practices, though, because other Jews remained important in the administration. Finally, the Civil War ended when Enrique trapped Pedro in an ambush and personally stabbed him to death, an event that was also described by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer acted as an envoy to the court of Pedro the Cruel and did a tribute to him in the Canterbury Tales and the Knight's Tale. Now, the cynical nature of this anti-Jewish practice under Enrique was quickly apparent, because as soon as he became king, he abandoned those practices and began to take Jews into his administration, just as every previous king of Castile did. But he set something he set off something that it couldn't be stopped, and that was fanaticism from one man, a man named Ferran Martinez, who was a priest outside the town of Seville, in the town of Marcilla. And he took up, right at this time, a personal, lifelong quest to attack the Jews. Now, very little is known about his life, and it's unclear why he was so fanatic in his devotion to that. And he did it against the opposition of all the leadership in Spain at the time. The church repeatedly told him to stand down. The king of Spain, both Enrique and Enrique's son, told him to stand down. He continuously defied them, preaching against the Jews, arguing that their synagogues needed to be burned down and that they needed to be punished and eventually converted. Finally, what happened was fate stepped in on the side of Ferran Martinez. He was about to be excommunicated by the Archbishop of Seville because of his continuous defiance of the church. The Archbishop died. The King of Spain died, leaving Spain in the hands of a young ill boy named the Doliente, or the ill one, and in the hands of a divided regency. So there was no longer any power in effect in Castile to restrain Ferran Martinez. He eventually incited mobs starting in Seville, again with the slogan, "Convert or die," and they raged through all the major cities of Castile, resulting in the death of thousands of Jews and the forced conversions of tens of thousands. Eventually, some of these forces were able to get into Aragon, the neighboring kingdom, which had a weak king who wasn't able to restrain them, and these mobs again rose up in all the major cities. By the end of the year, the Jewish communities had ceased to exist in many of the most important cities in Spain, including Barcelona, which had a Jewish community going back maybe to the Roman period. Eventually, he was restrained, but at this point, both the civil and the religious authorities led by a man now known as the anti-pope. This is during the period of the Great Western Schism, when there were 2 or 3 popes. He was the Avignon Pope. He originally was a Spaniard, and he hoped to use some of the anti-Jewish sentiment to gain his legitimacy to take over the papacy. They began to come up with plans to repressive plans against the remaining Jews in order to convince them to convert. In the same time, they set up a policy that all the Jews were converted, even though forced conversion is contrary to Christian doctrine, that because the sacraments had been completed, they would have to remain Christians, and if they reverted or tried to revert to Christianity, they would be considered heretics and subject to death. Now that policy wasn't universal. The King of Portugal, who at that time was trying to expand his economy and welcomed in Jewish settlements, openly embraced the policy of don't ask, don't tell. And he said that he would not look behind the basis of any Jews who came to this country, his country, and several Jews, including the Abravanel family, who I'll get back to later, did go back to Portugal and revert, after being forcibly reverted to Judaism. So now, eventually, the anti-pope lost office, and order was restored in both kingdoms, and they began to move back to the status quo, but they were now left with this new people, the conversos. They call them new Christians. They called them conversos. They called them by the insult term marrano. And they became immediately enormously successful, at least some of them. First of all, there were opportunities open to them that weren't open to them as Jews. Marriage. They could marry into some of the most important families in Spain, and they did so. The church, some of them became very important prelates, including a man named Torquemada, Juan de Torquemada, the uncle to Tomás de Torquemada, who we know of from the Inquisition. He's generally regarded as a converso. He became the most important prelate in Spanish prelate in the century. He became a cardinal and the defender of the faith in the Vatican, and may have been considered for the papacy at one point. But the question remains, who were the conversos in general, and what were their beliefs? There is a large body of evidence of Jewish belief among the conversos. But this is an inherently suspect body of evidence because it comes from the annals of the Inquisition. And of course, a lot of it was obtained through compulsion or even torture. But traditionally, this body of evidence has been taken at face value. So older historians did traditionally view these conversos as people who were largely secret Jews. And even Jewish historians like Yitzhak Beyer, who wrote the two-volume The History of the Jews in Christian Spain, embraced this evidence because he saw it as evidence of Jewish resistance to Christianity and to them holding on to their original faith. More recently, a historian whose name would be familiar to you, named Benzion Netanyahu, who's father to the current prime minister, he started advocating the idea that in fact, at least by the second generation, these were sincere Christians for the most part. And he found other forms of evidence to show that they were, by traditional Jews, they regarded as not as anusim or forced converts, but as heretics. And he did this in books like his Origin of the Inquisition in 15th century Spain. Now, I think the general consensus is something in between these two ideas, recognizing the inherent unreliability of the Inquisition annals, that the conversos were a mix of a lot of things. They were probably, at least facially, Christian. They were probably followed the Christian religion. One of the problems with the Inquisition accusations is a lot of the things they accused them of doing really related more to customs and habit than belief. They considered these to be heretical acts, but we wouldn't consider them to be heretical today. So you could have people living as Christians, but they might not eat pork. Or they might sometimes obey the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath. These people, the new Christians, still had many family members who were Jews. They still socialized with them. They went to Jewish observances, and many of these family observances, Jewish family observances, were also religious observances. So you might live as a Christian but attend a family seder of your own family. That might be seen as heresy, but they might see it as a family observance. There were funeral customs that they continue to adhere to. Again, the Inquisition views these as heretics. So I think the general consensus is there probably wasn't widespread heresy, but there was a mix of various habits and traditions which, under the views of the time, made them be viewed as heretics. Now, what happened, the problem that the conversos faced, I think, was principally political instability in Castile in the 15th century. They became, as I indicated, very successful. One of the reasons for their success was political. Juan II, who became king of Castile, and his very powerful minister, Alvaro de Luna, began to engage in what was a standard medieval conflict among kings, which was a conflict for power, trying to concentrate power in the crown as opposed to a very powerful aristocracy. And they found that one way to exercise that power, and this became more common later on in the rest of Europe, was by using technocrats to run the government. And so they began recruiting people in the government who were known as letratos, or learned people, many of them from the University of Salamanca, and many of them were conversos, including the chief of staff to Juan II. So they became very closely allied with the ruler of Castile, but it was a very controversial rule, mainly because of this conflict that developed between the aristocrats and the king. Civil war erupted frequently, and what would happen is that the conversos began to be scapegoated because of their alliance with the king, and that was part of what led to the rumors that they were secret Jews. And the most important event during the reign of Juan II, when this happened, was during a revolt in Toledo in 1448. When Toledo declared independence, they revolted because of a very unpopular tax imposed by Alvaro de Luna. But then they quickly began to attack the conversos and loot them. And I think their initial motivation for doing this was just greed. Conversos were rich. But in order to rationalize that attack, they started accusing them of heresy. They formed their own inquisition, which was illegal. They didn't have the authority to do that. And eventually they came up with an innovation, which I'll try to return to later on, which became very important, which was the first racial exclusion rules in modern Europe. They passed laws that precluded them from holding office until they had been Christians for 4 generations. Now the 4-generation rule was a very cynical rule. There was no religious or other precedent for that. It was purely mathematics. Since the mass conversions took place in 1391, if you barred them for 4 generations, that meant that no one presently serving in Toledo would have to compete with conversos. So anyway, this instability led to popular dissatisfaction with the conversos, and that became even greater during the even greater instability of the successor to Juan II, who was Enrique IV of Castile, until finally open warfare developed between the old Christians and the new Christians, battles in towns like Toledo, in Cordoba, where there was a massacre of conversos, and in Seville. This instability would end with a successor to Enrique, who is his half-sister, Isabel, under the reign of the people now known as the Christian monarchs, Fernando and Isabel. This is Toledo, and that's the young Isabel and Fernando, her husband. And as you can see, although we think of them now as the most stable, powerful rulers in the history of Spain, as the founders of one of the greatest empire in history, as they conquered Latin America, and as the Catholic monarchs, which was a title conferred to them by the Pope, they began through a history of much more instability. Isabel had a very weak claim on the throne. They had to fight a civil war to get her installed in Castile. Fernando himself was not meant initially for the monarchy. He succeeded his brother, and the throne of Aragon too suffered civil war throughout his entire life until he took power. And so when they came to the throne, they didn't come as stable, mature, powerful monarchs, but they came as very insecure monarchs who were anxious to hold on to power. What was their attitude towards the Jews and the conversos? Initially, it was very good. I mean, I like to quote the famous nursery rhyme from Longfellow about the little girl with a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. For the Jews, when they were good, they were very, very good, but when they were bad, they were horrid. And then initially, they were very, very good. Jews who had been excluded from court for several generations because the conversos began to take up the places that had formerly been given to the Jews, now came back. This is because a man named Abraham Señor, who was in the treasury of the town of Segovia, became one of the very early and most powerful supporters of Isabel and her claim to the throne. He helped finance her wedding, and he became a very close advisor in her court. and she valued him so much that she made him the treasurer for a new police force she founded called the Hermandad. And eventually he brought in the most talented Jew of the period, Isaac Abravanel, who was a great writer in philosophy as well as an administrator. So Jews began to play a very prominent role in their court that hadn't been played for generations. And as for the conversos, Isabel worshipped her father, Juan II, and emulated his idea of putting letratos, or educated people, into their administration. And again, many of these were conversos. So conversos played a very important and influential role in both the courts of Aragon and Castile. And yet, they decided to start an inquisition. In 1481, they requested permission from the Pope to begin an inquisition in Seville. So why this contradiction? I think the explanation is that because of their initial immaturity, the instability of the country, the fact that they had to struggle, mainly in the South, and because of all the conflicts that developed in the South between the old Christians and new Christians, they latched on the Inquisition as a way to end this conflict. And they probably initially thought it as a short-term solution to get stability back and gain power in the South. And there had been a tradition in Aragon of an inquisition, both Aragon and Castile, that they would have known of. There was a remnant of the Inquisition against the Cathars in Aragon that was largely toothless, and an attempt was made to